There are weeks that change governments, weeks that start wars, weeks that redraw borders. And then there is this week, a week remembered not because it moved an empire overnight, but because, for millions of people, it redefined what suffering, sacrifice, and victory could mean. At first glance, it looks like the collapse of a movement. A teacher is arrested, his followers scatter. A public execution ends what many may have thought was a rising hope. But that is only one layer of the story. Because depending on where you stand, this week can be read in three very different ways: as history, as testimony, or as meaning. And the tension between those three layers is exactly why people still talk about it more than 2,000 years later. What really happened in the final days of Jesus' life? That question has never gone away. There are events in the story that are broadly presented in the text as public actions. Jesus entering Jerusalem, conflict with religious leaders, the last meal with his disciples, his arrest, trial, crucifixion, burial, and then the claims that followed about an empty tomb and post-death appearances. But surrounding those events are other things that belong to a different category: personal experiences, witness claims, theological interpretations, deep meanings that believers see in the events. But that should not be presented as neutral historical certainty. So to understand this week without exaggeration, we have to keep the layers separate. Fact: there was a final public sequence of events involving Jesus in Jerusalem that ended in crucifixion. Testimony: followers and later witnesses described what they believed they saw, heard, and experienced. Interpretation: many Christians understand that week as the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. That distinction matters, and it makes the story stronger, not weaker, because the closer you look, the more the week feels like a collision between visible events and invisible meaning. By the time Jesus entered his final week, the movement around him had already become impossible to ignore. According to the gospel accounts, he had spent years teaching, healing, confronting religious hypocrisy, and drawing crowds across multiple towns and regions. The text presents him not merely as a teacher with ideas, but as someone whose words forced people to take sides. That is one of the most important factual patterns in the source material. He did not leave people neutral. Some followed, some doubted, some were threatened. And as the accounts build toward Jerusalem, the atmosphere changes. The story no longer feels open-ended. It begins to tighten. Every conversation feels heavier. Every public appearance feels more dangerous. The closer Jesus gets to the city, the more the narrative starts to move with the logic of an unavoidable confrontation. That does not mean everyone understood what was coming. In fact, the source repeatedly suggests the opposite. Many around him seem to misunderstand both his identity and his mission, even at the moment events were unfolding. That misunderstanding becomes one of the key engines of the whole week. Part of the rising tension came from what Jesus was reported to have said about himself. In the gospel narrative, there are moments when his words were understood by opponents as claims that went far beyond prophecy or moral authority. That is why the conflict with religious leaders was not presented merely as political disagreement or personality clash. It was also about identity, authority, and blasphemy as they understood it. From the standpoint of the narrative, these statements escalated everything. Fact within the source: Jesus made statements that triggered attempts to stone him and intensified hostility. Interpretation within the source: many believers read these moments as Jesus revealing divine identity. Caution: that interpretation should be presented as belief grounded in the text, not as a neutral historical conclusion everyone must accept. That distinction is crucial for YouTube's safe storytelling. The power is still there, but the certainty stays honest. Because once those claims entered the public space, the conflict was no longer just about popularity. It became existential. If his words were true, they changed everything. If they were false, then to his opponents they were intolerable. That is what gives the week its pressure. One event in the source functions like a final trigger. the raising of Lazarus. According to the Gospel account, Lazarus had already been dead and buried when Jesus arrived, and Jesus then called him out of the tomb. In the narrative, this becomes one of the clearest reasons public attention surged and opposition hardened. Now, because this event comes to us through the text as testimony and sacred narrative, it should be framed carefully. Fact from the source. The Lazarus story is presented as a major turning point that intensified the reaction to Jesus. Testimony. Witnesses in the narrative are described as seeing Lazarus come out of the tomb. Interpretation. Many believers view this as a decisive sign of authority over death itself. What matters for the flow of the week is not only whether the event is believed, but what it did to the political and religious atmosphere in the story. After that, the danger no longer feels abstract. The authorities are no longer simply irritated. They appear alarmed. The movement is becoming too visible, too public, too volatile. And that is when the story starts moving from tension to decision. The source describes a moment when the religious leadership moves from concern to active plotting. This matters because it shifts the narrative from reaction to strategy. Jesus is no longer just someone they argue with in public. He becomes someone they must stop. The reasons given in the source are layered. There is concern about influence, concern about public unrest, concern about what Roman authorities might do if the situation appears unstable. There is also a moral reading in the text that points to envy and rejection. Here again, the categories help. Fact within the narrative. The religious leaders are described as formally plotting Jesus' death. Interpretation. The text also frames their motives in moral and spiritual terms. Caution. We should not flatten every motive into a single modern explanation when the source itself presents overlapping tensions. That layered approach actually increases retention because it gives the audience more to think about, not just what happened, but why groups turned when they did. And once that private decision is made, the city itself begins to feel like a trap. Then comes the arrival. Jesus enters Jerusalem and is greeted by a crowd with language and gestures associated with expectation, celebration, and kingship. In the source, this moment feels triumphant, but the deeper you look, the more unstable it becomes. Because public excitement is not the same thing as understanding. Some viewers of the story see this as the city welcoming its true king. Others note that many in the crowd may have carried political expectations that the story would not fulfill in the way they imagined. That tension matters. Fact from the narrative. Jesus enters Jerusalem publicly and is welcomed by a crowd. Interpretation. Many Christians understand this as messianic fulfillment. Analytical angle. The same crowd energy that celebrates can also turn when expectations collapse. That is one of the most unsettling dynamics in the entire week. Public support in moments of excitement is often shallower than it looks. And once the script people expect begins to break apart, praise can decay into disappointment faster than anyone wants to admit. The week is now in motion, and it will not slow down. If the entry created expectation, the temple incident created confrontation. According to the source, Jesus entered the temple area and drove out merchants and money changers, condemning what the space had become. In storytelling terms, this is one of the sharpest scenes in the whole week because it moves from symbolic tension to visible action. This is not background conflict anymore. It is public disruption at the center of religious life. Fact from the source. Jesus disrupted commerce in the temple precincts and condemned the corruption he saw there. Interpretation. Many believers read this as righteous judgment. Analytical angle. From a power perspective, this act made neutrality almost impossible. The moment works so powerfully because it is not random anger. It is targeted, directed, timed. And in narrative terms, once this happens, the road ahead narrows dramatically. The authorities now have stronger incentive. The city is crowded for Passover. Emotions are already high. A charismatic teacher has public attention and is openly challenging established structures. From here, the question is no longer whether there will be a collision. only when. Stay with this story, because what happens next is where everything begins to unravel. Movements often expect attack from enemies. What they rarely survive well is fracture from within. That is why Judas matters so much in the story. According to the source, Judas agrees to help the authorities identify and deliver Jesus privately. The text assigns spiritual and moral weight to his action, but when rewriting carefully, we should avoid pretending we can map his inner psychology with certainty beyond what the source allows. Fact from the narrative. Judas arranges to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Interpretation in the source. His action is framed as betrayal of profound moral and spiritual seriousness. Caution. Motives can be discussed, but not declared with more certainty than the text gives. And that uncertainty makes the betrayal darker, not lighter. Was it greed? Disillusionment? Confusion? A breaking point no one else saw? The source does not fully satisfy that question. It leaves a wound in the story, and that wound opens the door to the next scene. Before the arrest, the story pauses for one of its most intimate moments. Jesus shares a final meal with his disciples. During that meal, according to the source, he predicts betrayal, breaks bread, shares wine, and attaches new meaning to both. He also washes the disciples' feet, turning authority upside down through an act of service. This scene is essential because it compresses the entire emotional architecture of the week into one room: loyalty, confusion, ritual, warning, love, and loss. Fact from the source. A final meal took place in which Jesus spoke about betrayal and linked bread and wine to his body and blood. Interpretation. Christians widely understand this as the foundation of a sacramental act remembered ever since. Testimony. What the disciples understood in that moment appears limited. Fuller meaning is often shown only in hindsight. That hindsight is key. One of the deepest storytelling truths in the week is that people inside the moment do not fully understand the moment. Meaning comes later, sometimes much later. That is why the next scene hits so hard. After the meal comes the garden. The movement slows, the noise drops, the city recedes, and for a brief moment, the story becomes almost unbearably personal. According to the source, Jesus goes to Gethsemane to pray in anguish. The text presents him as deeply distressed, fully aware that arrest and suffering are near. Some details in the narrative are highly physical and intense, and because they are part of sacred testimony, they should be framed that way. Fact from the source. Jesus prayed in deep anguish before his arrest. Testimony from the text. The description of sweat like drops of blood is presented as part of that moment. Caution. Medical explanations may be mentioned only as possibilities, not as hard proof of what occurred. Then the stillness breaks. Judas arrives. Guards come with him. There is a kiss. A disciple reacts violently. Jesus is arrested. And then, something psychologically devastating happens. His followers scatter. Hours earlier, they had pledged loyalty. Now, fear takes over. That detail is not weakness in the story. It is realism, and it makes what follows feel painfully human. From here, the narrative accelerates through a sequence of hearings and handoffs. Questioning before Jewish authorities, Peter's denial nearby, formal condemnation for blasphemy within the logic of the source, transfer to Pilate, then to Herod, then back again. This is where the documentary tone matters most. We do not need to overclaim to make it powerful. Fact from the source. Jesus was interrogated by Jewish authorities, then brought before Roman power. Fact from the source. Pilate appears hesitant at points, and Herod mocks rather than resolves the matter. Interpretation. Many readers see the process as morally corrupt and driven by fear, expediency, and rejection. The emotional center of this stretch may actually be Peter. While the system closes in on Jesus, one of his closest followers collapses under pressure outside. He denies knowing him 3 times. The source frames that moment with devastating intimacy, not because Peter was uniquely weak, but because he was recognizably human. That is an important retention beat in the middle of the story. The week is not only about institutions failing, it is also about individuals failing under fear. And by dawn, the center cannot hold. Once Jesus stands before Pilate, the story enters a different kind of danger. It is no longer only theological, it is political, public, irreversible. Pilate, according to the source, does not seem eager to execute Jesus at first. Yet the pressure around him grows. The crowd demands death. Barabbas is chosen for release instead. Jesus is flogged, mocked, crowned with thorns, and finally handed over. Why did the crowd turn? The source gives scenes, not a modern sociological essay. So we should be careful. But analysis is still possible when clearly labeled as analysis. One possible reading is this. Many people may have hoped for a liberator who would confront Rome visibly and decisively. What they saw instead was a beaten prisoner who did not resist in the way they expected. For some, that gap between hope and reality may have fueled rage or rejection. That is not a hard fact. It is an interpretive frame. But it fits the emotional movement of the narrative. And once the sentence is set, the week crosses into its darkest stretch. Watch closely, because the next moments are the reason this story has never been forgotten. The crucifixion is the visual center of the story, but it should not be told carelessly. According to the source, Jesus was led out, weakened, forced toward the place of execution, nailed to a cross beside criminals, mocked by onlookers, and left to die by crucifixion. His mother and a small number of followers remain present. Others are absent. The physical suffering is central, but the narrative also insists that something more than physical suffering is being expressed. Here the three layers become absolutely necessary. Fact within the source. Jesus was crucified publicly under Roman authority. Testimony from the source. Unusual darkness is reported during the final hours. Interpretation. Many Christians believe the crucifixion was not merely an execution, but an atoning act tied to sin, redemption, and reconciliation with God. Those meanings should be spoken as belief, not imposed as neutral fact. But they cannot be removed either, because they are the heart of what the story means to believers. The final words matter for the same reason. It is finished. Historically, we can say the source presents these as final words of profound significance. Theologically, many hear in them the completion of a mission. Narratively, they land like the end of everything, but only for a moment. Because the story does not stop at death, Jesus is buried. A tomb is secured. The movement appears broken. This is the point where many stories would end. Instead, this one becomes even harder to classify, because what follows belongs largely to testimony. According to the source, women come to the tomb and find it empty. Mary Magdalene becomes one of the first figures associated with the discovery. The disciples initially do not all respond with belief. There is confusion, disbelief, running, searching, hesitation. Then come claims of appearances to Mary, to other women, to disciples, to Thomas, to followers on the road, and later to larger groups. To keep this honest, we must say it plainly. Fact from the source. The text reports an empty tomb and multiple resurrection appearances. Testimony. These appearances are presented as experiences of people who believed they saw the risen Jesus. Interpretation. Christians understand these events as the resurrection and the decisive victory over death. That structure preserves truthfulness without draining the scene of force. And the force is enormous, because whether one accepts the resurrection as historical miracle, theological claim, or sacred testimony, the source presents it as the turning point that transformed fear into proclamation. That transformation is itself one of the strongest narrative facts in the aftermath. Something happened after the crucifixion that prevented the story from ending as a failed movement. That is historically important, even if people disagree fiercely about why. The disciples who had hidden and scattered are later presented as proclaiming boldly. The message spreads, the movement grows, Suffering does not stop it. Suppression does not erase it. For believers, the reason is clear. They were convinced Jesus had risen. For historians, the growth of the movement is undeniable, even if interpretations differ. That is the final tension of the week. Not merely that Jesus died, but that his death did not end the story. And not merely that resurrection was preached, but that this preaching reshaped lives, communities, and eventually the world. So what was this week? A political execution? A collapse of messianic expectation? A chain of testimony that gave birth to faith? Or, as many believers hold, the central act of redemption in human history? The answer depends on the layer you are willing to stand in. As fact, it is the story of arrest, trial, crucifixion, burial, and claims that followed. As testimony, it is the story of people who said they saw, heard, failed, wept, ran, doubted, and then believed. As interpretation, it is for many the week in which apparent defeat became victory. And maybe that is why it still grips people. Because it does not force itself into a single category. It arrives as history. It survives as witness. And for millions, it lives as meaning. If this version made you look at the story differently, leave your perspective below. Sometimes the most powerful discussions begin not with certainty, but with a careful distinction between what happened, what was witnessed, and what it meant.